Okay, well, welcome to a full hall. We are allowed the legal limit of 70, and I think we have 64 people here today. And yet there's a few that were enrolled and still haven't turned up, so we may well fill every chair in the hall. So, thank you, Keith. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Keith Corbett, because we're just so lucky here for lots of reasons in Tasmania. But our geology in Tasmania tells such a wonderful story, and what Keith Corbett does is acts as that translator. So when you walk along the rocks and think, what in the hell happened here? Keith is actually able to translate some of that and tell us. And because we have Joe Crothers amongst us, we've had, so many of us have had our geology eyes turned on. So to have Keith add to that story today will just be absolutely fantastic. So welcome to Keith.
Thanks very much, Rhys. And it is a pleasure to be here in Wynyard. I'm an old northwest coaster. That's my family there at Brianna in 1946. That's where I was born and brought up. Which one is me, do you think? I'm the second youngest. Excuse me. 4 older brothers and 1 younger brother. And I tell you what, that young brother, what a pain in the arse he was. But there we were, just a small farm. We grew potatoes and milk dairy cows, as you do. And I was the only one that went to university and did all of that stuff. But I've kept in touch pretty closely with our family and the boys, and there are only 3 of us left these days, but that's how it goes. Wynyard is this nice place. Wynyard, I think, is the nicest of the Northwest Coast towns. And I spent time living in Ulverston, and I went to high school in Denver. I had a fair bit to do with Penguin. They're a bit overdeveloped for my liking these days. And it's nice to come to a place where, you know, it's still fairly natural and not overdone. And we really like coming back to Wynyard. And the geology here is just bloody marvellous. So I've got a lot to get through today. There's 1 billion years of Earth history to cover in about an hour, and that takes a bit of doing. So this is what I thought I would do. Give it to you in 2 parts, really. The big picture first of the continents, what happened to the continent, where Tasmania came from, out of that story, and then come back and look at the rocks in more detail that were formed along the way, with a particular emphasis on the rock units here at Wynyard. So let's see how we go. Where do I point this? There. Okay. No, I missed one. No, I didn't. That's the present situation with the Earth. We know the Earth's made of continents and oceans. The continents are lighter material, a lot of quartz in the continents, so they float on the surface. Continental crust floats on the surface. And the Earth's crust is divided into a whole series of plates, 30-odd different plates of various sizes, some of them really big, some of them very small. And they're all moving. And this has been an absolute revolution in Earth's understanding, is the continents are all moving, but very, very slowly. Somewhere between 5 and 15 centimetres per year. So there, I think we can, I'll keep doing it, I reckon. pressing along a bit. In Australia, we're moving north at about 7 centimetres a year. So if you live to be 100 in Wynyard, you'll be 7 metres closer to the equator by the time you die. You may not know the difference. So there are these spreading ridges in the middle of the oceans all the way around. That's where the Earth is diverging. Basalts are coming in and making new ocean crust in here. Continents are being carried along. They just get carried along like bits of cargo, really. And then they collide with one another in different places around the world and push up mountain ranges. So the Earth is a really mobile, active place. But it's happening really, really slowly. And that's why we're not aware of it. We think everything is stable. But things are moving at about the rate that our fingernails grow. So we just don't comprehend it. But that's the situation as we know it now, that the Earth is moving, continents are moving, and continents are breaking up, coming together, making supercontinents, splitting apart again. Every piece of continent around the world has come from somewhere else. So that's something you sort of have to get used to. I can't get the one I want. Oops, I saw it there.
Might be easier to use the cursor on the computer.
Just as the arrows.
No?
There. That's the one I want. I won't use them. So this is the way I explain what drives the continents to move. And it's a pretty simple process. You've all boiled a billy.
Please. It's being videoed.
You've all boiled a billy or a saucepan in your life, I'm sure. And you will know that if you've got a fairly intense heat source underneath your billy, what happens is that the hot water rises up to the top, spreads out, and then comes down again. And that's called a convection cell. Convection cells are the key to why continents are moving. The crustal bits, we can call them pieces of toast floating on the water, for example, they get carried along by this moving water under here, and they will congregate where the water goes down again, on the edges in this case. See that process? Mm-hmm. Move your hotspot, your heat source, to underneath one of those aggregations, and it all breaks up again. And they get carried away to somewhere where it's coming down again. That's the process that breaks up and moves continents. Look at the Earth here, it's a three-dimensional billy. It's got a hot, molten core in here with hot spots around. Each one of those hot spots drives a convection cell very slowly up through the mantle, 3,000 kilometres of rock, but it moves very slowly. And up near the surface, underneath the continents, that drag of the mantle underneath pulls the continents apart and congregates them, aggregates them, where the convection cells come down. And when you get an aggregation of continents like that, it's called a supercontinent. And they can be stable for quite some time, but the hot spots in the core move, otherwise the Earth would be a wonderfully stable place if the hot spots were always in the same place. But being molten, the core has turbulence and its own convection currents and things in it. So the hotspots move, and when you move a hotspot and it's underneath one of these supercontinents, it very slowly drags it apart again. And that's what happens over time. That takes about 300 million years to drag a supercontinent apart and set up another arrangement. But the Earth's got plenty of time. Got about 3,000 million years to play with. So that's the process. That simple convection cell hotspot process is what drives continents to move. And if everybody understands that, then the fact that the continents are moving is not such a surprise. It's what you would expect. We've dealt with that in the wrong order, but I've dealt with it. So let's go back to the beginning of the Tasmanian story, back in the Precambrian, when those old quartzites that we see around Rocky Cape, Kooey, Foreshore and Burnie, and all those southwest places. This is the situation back then, 1.4 billion years ago. That's how old they are. 1,400 million years. And this is something like the arrangement of continents then. Here's where Tasmania was, sort of stuck on the boundary between North America, which was called Laurentia those days, and Antarctica here. Australia was here. Those are the three old parts of Australia which have just been fused together, but it's in the process of docking with North America and Antarctica. Tasmania was already there. We are different from the rest of Australia. And there's bits of China and Russia stuck on here, Eastern Europe. So it's a completely different arrangement of continents. So that's about 1,400 million years ago. This is Rodinia, about 900. That's a pain. Sorry. That's Rodinia. And you can see North America is now starting to move away. And it went off up into the Northern Hemisphere and did its own thing. But we were part of North America. And I suspect Jacob Mulder's probably told you a bit about that in a previous lecture, how our old rocks indicate we were close to a part of North America.
We were lucky enough to have Jacob Mulder
Yes.
to do his presentation,
Yes.
so yeah, he told us all about that, which was fantastic.
It was a really nice bit of work.
Yeah.
Fingerprinting Tasmanian old rocks and matching that up. It's really like a fingerprint with the North American fingerprint as well. And it's pretty conclusive. So Laurentia's on its way, and we're still here as part of Antarctica. Australia's just about docked in here now. India, South Africa, South America, starting to come together to form Gondwana. That's what the process was happening here. And here's Gondwana, which is our mother continent, really. I hate that. Good. South America's here, Africa is here, India is in here, Antarctica is in here, Australia is in here, and here's Tasmania right out on this corner. We were here for a very long time. This is where most of Tasmania was put together when we were part of Antarctica. from about 550 million years to about 150, something like that. This is where we were, part of sort of eastern Australia, and this is a Paleozoic origin, which is where things are happening all across eastern Australia, southern part of Antarctica, into South America. So all of our Cambrian rocks, the Mount Reed volcanics, the Jeff Iliff would know a bit about, and the conglomerates of the West Coast Range, Mount Roland, all those things, the great limestone formations, Mole Creek, Gunns Plains, all happened here. The Tasmanian granites were intruded while we were here. The Permian glacial deposits like the Wynyard Tillite, that's where we were when that was deposited. And the Triassic sandstones and our coal metres all happened while we were here. And we were here for about 300 million years. So that's where we grew up, on that corner of Antarctica. And in the Jurassic, about 180 million years ago, the hotspot started to move. Gondwana started to break up. And the first sign of that was the intrusion of the dolerite, the Tasmanian dolerites. And when you plot those Jurassic dolerites, it's a really interesting distribution. There's Tasmania sort of smack in the middle. Right across Antarctica, there are Jurassic dolerites. Right into South Africa, into Africa, there are dolerites and Jurassic basalt. Huge quantities of them. But when you try to get onto mainland Australia, it just stops dead. There's a little tiny bit of Jurassic basalt at a place called Coleraine in Victoria. And there's a little bit of Jurassic basalt on Kangaroo Island. But there's no dolerite as such on mainland Australia anywhere for the Jurassic. And that's a huge difference. That tells us that Tasmania is more Antarctica than it is Australia. Because the dolerite is very characteristic of Antarctic geology. And if you know, there's not much dolerite at Wynyard, I'm sorry, down this end of the coast you miss out a bit, or maybe you're lucky. Go to the central plateau, central part of Tasmania. This is one of my favourite dolerite pictures. This is Sib and our two kids on Mount Ossa, which is the highest point of Tasmania. And up there, it's all dolerite. You look around and there are dozens and dozens of dolerite mountains in all directions. And characteristics are these columnar joining that you can see, and these great swathes of dolerite scree around the slopes. I'm sure you've all seen dolerite. If you've been to the Central Plateau, the Great Lake, up the Lake Highway, you've seen those big dolerite columns. If you've been to Mount Wellington, you've seen dolerite. You've been to Cradle Mountain, you've seen dolerite. It's very widespread in Tasmania. About 2/3 of the state is covered by dolerite, but not the northwest coast. And this is how our dolerite mountains are formed, more or less. The dolerite comes intruding up through cracks in these old folded rocks here. And then when it gets to the Permian Triassic rocks, which are still horizontal, it finds it easier to go sideways. So it pushes out sideways through these horizontally layered rocks and forms these great big thick sills we call them. And they can be up to nearly 1,000 metres thick, typically 300 to 500 metres. Then if you weather those dolerite plateaus, make valleys through them, what you end up with is a flat-topped, dolerite-capped mountain with columns around the cliff edges and lots of dolerite boulders forming a screed down the sides. And if you go to mainland Australia, you won't see any of those. We have literally hundreds of dolerite mountains. I did a count of them back in my book. And I counted over 600, there you go. And that's about 2/3 of our total mountains. So we're the dolerite capital of the world, really. So Gondwana's breaking up now, the hotspot's really going, the continents are being pulled apart, and this was the situation at about 40 million years ago. South America is pulled away, Africa's pulled away, and they've separated from one another on the spreading ridge here. India has bolted northwards at nearly 20 centimetres a year. That's bolting speed for a continent. It's crossed the equator and it's colliding with Asia here, pushing up the Himalayan mountains. That's what's happening at that collision. But Australia and Antarctica are still joined. And it seems to me, if you can be anthropomorphic about it, Antarctica didn't really want to part with Tasmania. And it hung on to it for a long, long time. And that's the story really of Tasmania, is that pulling apart of Australia and Antarctica. And who ended up with Tasmania? And this is my reconstruction of what happened at that time. Here's Antarctica, here's Australia. Australia's going north, Antarctica's going south. And there's a spreading ridge coming through the Great Australian Bight. So most of Australia is separating away quite happily. And there's quite a big gap out here now with ocean floor basalts in. But when the spreading ridge, and they open like a zipper, a very slow zipper being pulled, that's a very good analogy. The zipper jams here, just off the Otways. And it should go through Bass Strait. It should have gone through that line there. But it didn't. And the reason I think for that, and I don't have any other explanation, is that there are two old granite arms that hold Tasmania to mainland Australia. One goes through the Furner Islands here, you know, the Flinders Island and all of the granite there. Deal Island is another one on the way. And that links up to Wilson's Promontory, where the granite comes up again. So there's a granite arm there, and there's another one here going through King Island to Mornington Peninsula. And those are like two big, strong arms holding the mainland to that bit of Tasmania. So what happens when a zipper jams like this and a spreading centre stops is that you get a great series of tears through the crustal fabric. You can imagine if you're opening a cardigan on a zipper, the zipper jams, you keep pulling, something's going to give, and what happens is that the fabric tears. So the fabric tore here, way down the western side of Tasmania, these great transcurrent faults. And this section of crust off the corner of Antarctica was dragged away on these great transcurrent faults for thousands of kilometres, very slowly. Took a long, long time. But eventually, this great wedge of crust here, with the South Tasman Rise down here, the East Tasman Plateau here, and the Tasmanian section in the middle, pulled away. An ocean crust formed in between. And Tasmania is now part of Australia. And we're probably thankful we're not still down there at 75 degrees south. And the reason we know that, we're quite certain about that, is because we can see all the evidence for that in the modern day submarine topography. This is a topographic map compiled from hundreds and hundreds of kilometres of marine surveys, all the way around Tasmania. And here's this wedge of crust. This is called the South Tasman Rise, this great block of crust. It's submerged under a kilometre of ocean. You don't see it, but it's there. So you wouldn't know it was there without, you know, marine surveys, sonar and so on. But it is there, and you can see the big fault scars. They're still here and running up the western side there. Those are huge topographic features on the scale of the Earth's surface. You just can't see it. But if you took the sea away and they were exposed on land, they would be world-class fault scales. Probably the biggest there are. And that's how we were born. We're part of Antarctica, wrenched away, attached to Australia. What also happened during that stretching, pulling period, which went on for quite a long time, was that the crust through Bass Strait was really stretched and thinned. And there were three separate basins formed, of which Bass Basin in the middle of Bass Strait is one. There's also the Otway Basin to the west, the Gippsland Basin to the east off Victoria, all due to that same stretching movement. Otway and Gippsland, and this is just our luck, Otway and Gippsland have quite important oil deposits in those Cretaceous and Tertiary sediments. Bass Basin has no oil, but we do have a gas deposit, quite an important gas deposit at Yolla. So this is the Yolla field here. But it doesn't do us much good because the gas is piped to Victoria and then comes back through the gas pipeline to Tasmania. We buy it back. So we really haven't done very well, despite the fact that here's the boundary between Tasmania and Victoria. It's right up here, close to Wilson's Prom. And so all the Bass Basin essentially is Tasmanian waters, but we didn't get any oil. And you can see all the drill holes, these little red circles are all the drilling that's been done. It's been drilled quite heavily. And so we know quite a lot about the Bass Basin. And what we do know is that it's sunk, subsided, collapsed 10 kilometres, which is a huge amount. So that stretching and thinning resulted in the bottom of the Bass Strait area just continuing to collapse. It's a huge, deep basin. It was never a hole because as it collapses a little bit, sediment washes in and fills it up again. So it's continually filling up and subsiding at the same time. Like a magic basin, really. The more you put in, the deeper it gets. And all of the sediment that washed into Bass Basin, and it's over 100,000 cubic kilometres, if that means anything. I did a rough calculation. On the side of this hole, 10 kilometres deep, over 100 wide and about 300 long, is a lot of cubic kilometres of sediment that has to come from somewhere. Most of it has come from northern Tasmania. And just following here, there are a few other smaller basins across the state. You can see the fault systems that went on at the time. Longford Basin is the big one, Tamar Graben, Devonport, Port Sorell, and a couple over here in the east. There's a couple of small ones on the Derwent, one here at Oyster Bay, and Macquarie Harbour over here. All happened during that stretching process.
Are they considered to be rift valleys or something?
Yes, they're rift valleys. Graben is the geological term. Just to look at the stratigraphic picture, this is the Bass Basin stratigraphy, and it's going down in millions of years over here with Cretaceous and then Cenozoic. It's quite old. It started here in the early Cretaceous about 140 million years ago, receiving sediment, and it's filled up with some basalt, but mostly just river sediments, washing in some coal at times, lakes at times, until we get up here to late Oligocene, early Miocene, just over 20 million years ago, when the sea finally gets into Bass Strait. Prior to that, it was just a landlocked basin, river basin. But the sea finally broke through, probably through somewhere over near King Island, and from then on, what you see in the Bass Basin and right across the Bass Strait area is marine, limey sediments, of which Fossil Bluff is a characteristic type. So that's when Fossil Bluff forms, when the sea finally gets into Bass Strait in that early Miocene. This is from a paper I've done recently on the history of the Tamar Valley, and the Tamar Graben here is all non-marine, all river deposits, same with Longford and these places. It's only Bass Strait that had the sea. So I've reconstructed Bass Strait here about 50 million years ago. No sea, just a great big river valley with probably an outlet over here near King Island somewhere. High country all around, mountains down here in Tasmania, big rivers feeding material out into this central basin. The Tamar was probably one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest actual river, and there were lakes we know of back here. But all of the northwest coast rivers would have been active then. All of them eroding the rocks along the northwest coast, carrying it out into Bass Strait. It was quite possible that whatever was sitting above the Wynyard tillite back then got eroded at that time, because there's an awful lot of rocks missing above the tillite somewhere.
Keith, do those circles represent where there's been drilling for gas?
Yes, those are the drill holes again. Yeah. And you can see Yolla is here right in the deepest part of the basin. Yeah. So Bass Strait's an interesting place, but it wasn't a strait for a long time. It was just a big valley with no sea in it. So here we are now. This is what's happened to Gondwana when that big active hotspot developed underneath it and caused the continents to be broken apart, carried away. Here's where we've come from. Here's where we are now. And that's 3,500 kilometres that we've travelled over about 50 million years. You can work that out, and it's about 6 or 7 centimetres a year. You get a long way in a long time. In a very long time. But the Earth has a long time. Earth time is enormous. Even if the rates of movement are imperceptibly slow to us, there is still a huge amount of time to do things with. And, you know, South America's out here, Africa's gone way up here, India's gone out of sight, of course. And our Antarctic people that go down to work on our stations, which are around here, they're sort of retracing the continental steps back to Antarctica in a sense, from where Tasmania came from. But it only takes, I don't know, how long does it take? 4 or 5 days or something to go by boat back there.
Can I just ask you, the Bass Strait stuff you've done in the last 10 minutes, the maps that you've shown, are they included in your book?
No, there's some recent stuff there. There is a reconstruction of Bass Strait in the book,
Yeah.
but some of this is a little bit more recent. Most of it's in there, though.
Keith, Antarctica seems to have been very, very stable. Is that correct?
That is correct, and
Why is that?
I don't know.
Why? That's why I asked the question.
But it's a good question. No, I don't know. Antarctica seems to have been anchored over the South Pole all through the Gondwana period, and it's still anchored there. And
Has that got anything to do with magnetic alignment in the Earth?
sorry?
Has that got anything to do with magnetic alignment in the Earth, perhaps?
Well, obviously where the poles are controls, but the Earth's magnetism is controlled by the Earth's core. Because it's molten and moving, it creates a magnetic field which comes out of the crust at the poles, or at the magnetic poles.
That changes too, doesn't
It does. Just don't be around when there's a magnetic, what's it called, magnetic reversal. Because they happen.
Keith, would centrifugal forces have anything to do with that, given that Antarctica is at a pole where the others are subject to wider centrifugal forces? Is that plausible?
Well, that's a good question. I think I'll have to think about that.
I like the line of reasoning.
The Earth is rotating
Yes.
around there, but it's what's happening in the core and where the hotspots in the core are that determines how stable or how movable the various continental pieces are. So it must be something to do with stability in the core.
So I just want to interrupt in that people often have difficulty hearing. If you're asking a question, can you bellow it so that other people can hear it, or can you repeat it, please?
Okay, I can do that. Yes.
Can I just ask you about Macquarie Island? Is that an anomaly in that previous discussion you had about the fault lines and so on?
Macquarie Island is an anomaly in the same sense that Iceland is an anomaly, in that they both sit on over the top of the spreading ridge. So where the Earth's pulling apart and basalts are coming up out of the mantle and creating new ocean crust, Macquarie Island is a fossil version of that. It's an old one, but it's made of those oceanic basalts and oceanic igneous rocks. Iceland is an active one, where Iceland is actually splitting apart. The Atlantic rift zone goes through Iceland, very slow, but it is rifting apart, and there are volcanoes erupting on either side. So it gives us a pretty good sort of view of what happens at a spreading ridge. Otherwise you've got to go way down the bottom of the ocean to see what's happening. But Macquarie Island, really interesting place, because it is a fossil spreading ridge, or segment of one.
I don't know where I got the information from, but someone told me that the Bass Strait was very shallow, and that if you stuck the ferry on its end, you'd see the tip of it. So is this? I love hearing such things debunked, but it's so.
Bass Strait is shallow. Its average depth is 60 metres.
That's right.
And it's mostly covered with sand, so it's a very nice place to lay cables across, because there's no big hard rocks to tear it apart, and it's pretty flat.
So the deep 10 kilometres hole is not there anymore?
No, well, it never was a 10 kilometre hole. I suppose this is the difficulty. As it sinks, sediment washes in, so it's always flat, as it were. Can you envisage that? You're sort of subsiding but filling at the same time. Rivers are washing in at the same time. You can't have a hole in a place like that where there's sediment coming in, because it just fills up. But it filled up for a long time to give you 10 kilometres of sediment. I think that's the end of my first bit. So thank you all. It was good to have a break then. I was getting a bit tired pushing those continents around. So I would now like to look at the rocks that were formed along the way. That's perhaps the really interesting part, because of the things that you can actually see. And I'll go through this fairly quickly. Starting with the old Precambrian rocks, the things that were formed when we were still part of North America. 1.4 billion years ago. And we date rocks, as you probably know, using things like tiny little zircon crystals, which are really durable. Zircon hangs around just about for the full length of the life of the Earth. We have zircon crystals in Australia which are 4 billion years old in Western Australia. Just about the oldest datable original things on the Earth. Wonderful mineral, but easy to date and very accurate. And the zircon population from our Precambrian rocks matches the zircon population from those belt Purcell rocks in North America, which you would not expect, really, would you? Sid and I walked over those rocks in Montana, I think. Beautiful Rocky Mountain country with imprints of grizzly bears in the snow at one point, which kept us focused. Well, I had no idea then that I was walking over the equivalents of the nice Rocky Cape rocks or southwest Tasmanian rocks.
Can you tell me, Rocky Cape rocks are now say a penguin? I presume they are Rocky Cape rocks in some parts of penguin.
Yes, penguin.
Are they similar to the setup in the Table Cape area or what?
Basically the same age. Nearly all of our Tasmanian Precambrian rocks seem to come out at that 1.4 billion that we've dated anyway. The Rocky Cape rocks look less metamorphosed. They're still quite pristine in the sense that they've still got the original layering and cross-bedding and ripple marks and things in places. whereas some of the rock units in the middle of Tasmania, in the southwest and along the northwest, have done that subduction zone thing that I talk about in the book, being pulled down 60 kilometres into the mantle, heated up, squeezed to hell, and then spat back out again. So we've got rocks that have been through that process, and they look a bit different now because the minerals have been changed. And
Goat Island is slightly different to the what's named.
Goat Island has had a very severe history of squeezing. There are conglomerates of Goat Island on the foreshore there, where the pebbles, instead of being round, are now really lozenge-shaped. Hard quartzite pebbles that are now flat and like lozenges with great long tails out of each end. That takes a bit of doing. Yeah.
So when you talk about North America, does that include Canada?
Part of Canada, yeah. The big Canadian Shield part of Canada is part of Laurentia or North America, as we talk about. We don't differentiate the United States from Canada at that very early stage. No. So I know the Precambrian rocks best perhaps in southwest Tasmania, and this is an example from the Western Arthur Range. Sib actually took this photo, and it shows you what's happened to these rocks. These were original nice flat sand layers on a tidal flat in a shallow sea, and they've been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed again so that the original folds have been refolded, and they've had a pretty hard life. But because it's just quartz sand, you can't really change quartz sand very much. So what happens is the sand grains just fuse together, and that makes a sandstone into a quartzite. And once you squeeze a quartzite, you just get another quartzite. So not much happens to these rocks in terms of the metamorphic changes. They're good, hard rocks. This is Federation Peak, which is perhaps the most iconic of our Precambrian peaks. You fly past this if you've ever done that wonderful aerial trip to Melaleuca. On a good day, they'll come out right past Federation Peak and you get this view out the window. Sib and I have both climbed Federation Peak by slightly different routes. This is Bechevet's Plateau here. This is where you camp. If you walk into Federation Peak, you climb up Moss Ridge, I think, which is here somewhere, and then on the climbing day you go up over this thing around the Southern Traverse, which is somewhere around here, and then you climb up that face there. Quite an exhilarating day, I can tell you. I did it with my son John in 2000 when I was 60, and it's perhaps the most exhilarating day in the bush I've ever had. He was a lot younger than I was. But you get to the top, and this is the view, though, all of that fantastic great sweep of Precambrian mountains out there. And not a sign of human activity. It's a fabulous bit of wilderness. Yeah. That's Tom in front of me going up the last section of the climb. It's actually not difficult. It's not. There are plenty of footholds and handholds. You just don't want to look down. And it's even harder coming down, I have to say. Because there you can't help but look down. I came down behind John and I've just focused on a point midway between his shoulder blades. But if you're going up, you look down between your legs, you can see, what's the name of the little lake? The other lake, right down the bottom, about 1,000 metres below. And people have died on this climb, just as And that was one of the moves coming back down Moss Ridge, even getting up to the campsite. Pretty bloody strenuous stuff for a 60-year-old. The Mount Reed volcanics, the Cambrian rocks, they were formed when we were also stuck there in the side of Gondwana. You've heard about these. These have our mineral deposits in Mount Lyell and Rosebery and Headley, all those things. These are critical to Tasmania's economy. This is at Queenstown, Mount Lyell. There's one of the old smelter chimneys here. These are the bare hills from that original smelting process. They're revegetating now. It's actually one of the great sunset views. There's a little look at called Spine Cop there. Good sunsets. Jeff and I worked there for many a good year. Just passing through, really. These are the great conglomerates in the later part of that Cambrian period, about 500 million years ago. This is West Coast Range, looking up to Mount Murchison here. If you drive through here now, you drive on the Anthony Road and Lake Plimsoll. Thank you. Lake Plimsoll is in here. So this was taken before Lake Plimsoll. When I was mapping on the Denison Range, on the Tyndall Range. And that was my boss, who was a young upstart of a man. Insisted on coming out and seeing what we did in the field. And I did my best to tire him out every day. At one point, we stood up on a high point and we looked east into that central plateau, central range area where there's a huge sweep of wilderness north of the Eldons in that country. Perhaps the biggest single view of wilderness in Tasmania. And he said, Keith, don't you think this would look better with a few nice little villages scattered around? He was quite serious. He was English by extraction. And I said, don't be bloody ridiculous, Rob. But that's how the English people see their country. The little villages actually are very beautiful, as you know. They're made of stone, most of the buildings, and they sort of grow out of the landscape. So they do look at home. But that's not a Tasmanian wilderness. So that was an interesting exercise. Mount Roland is part of that story of those late Cambrian great river deposits, the conglomerates, and it's a lovely mountain, as you know. Quite sorry now that this track that goes up through the gully here is no longer accessible. Which is a bit sad. Oh, you can come round the back, but you have to go back the same way because of the private property issues in here.
Is the Arlen conglomerate, is that Arlen conglomerate?
That's Arlen conglomerate.
So how old is that, please?
It's late Cambrian,
It is like that.
480 million years, I think.
Right. So Valentine's Peak is the same category?
It is.
Okay.
Dial range is the same. One of the great conglomerate or gravel units in the world, really. And it's fantastic mountains, our conglomerate mountain. Some of my favourite places. Oh, there I am, up against a fairly coarse-grained bit of conglomerate. at Mount Lyell. These blocks are quite big, and you can imagine the size of the river floods that were bringing stuff that size. This is a picture of the limestone. I don't have many limestone pictures, but the Gordon limestone, the Ordovician limestone, is quite a distinctive and important part of our Paleozoic succession, and it's quite important economically. You'll know it from Gunns Plains, which is a limestone valley. You'll know it from Mole Creek, where the caves are. Other places like Vale of Belfire is one of my favourite places, which is a subalpine limestone valley. This is the Florentine Valley, and this place is called the Growling Swallow. For the reason that there's quite a substantial creek comes down off the Mountfield Range here and disappears into this hole, this cave, which growls, so it's called a Growling Swallow. But the thing about it is that it reappears back to the surface 10 kilometres away in a completely different valley at Medina, where it's called the Junee River. That's what happened underground.
How do you know that? You put dye in there?
Yes, it's been tested with dye, and it's also Cavaliers have been through, I think, and covered all of it underground, which is pretty strange. But it's one of the great underground sort of capture stories. This used to flow out across the valley into the Florentine River, then into the Derwent. Now it goes south into the Tyana River, and then into the Derwent down that way. So it all ends up in the Derwent. But this is a great place. Sid and I have taken groups in here several times over the last 12 months. And you sort of clamber down off the track. And it's just one of those, it's pristine rainforest. It's beautiful old rainforest with big, big trees. And it's just a wild kind of place with limestone doing what limestone does, which is make big underground caves. And the granites, you all know the granites, these are more characteristic of our east coast. Perhaps this is part of the hazards, but you have good granites here at South Rhona and places, and these are the last part of the Devonian before everything was folded. I just don't have time to talk about that folding period, the Tuggerabin orogeny, which was what folded all of these older rocks. Then there was a big period of erosion, everything eroded down, and then the Permian Carboniferous tillites deposited over the top of that, which is the Wynyard tilite. If you go on the boat cruise with East Coast Cruises, they're called around Maria Island, and I highly recommend that trip. This is what you'll see on the east coast of Maria Island, an exposure of this great unconformity between these horizontal Permian rocks up here, equivalents of the Wynyard tilite, and these old folded rocks down here underneath. Best exposure and unconformity in Australia, possibly the world, because it's so clean. Everything's washed off, and although you can't walk on it, you can only see it by boat.
Those bivalves, I've got scallops. I've got a fossil from Darlington. Those big scallops.
You go past the fossil cliffs near Darlington on the boat trip.
So when were they deposited?
They're Permian, and they're the same age as the Wynyard tilite.
Right.
Late Carboniferous, early Permian. Maria Island is a fabulous place for Permian geology, as well as this unconformity. It's nearly as good as Wynyard. So this was the situation at Wynyard tilite time in that late Carboniferous, early Permian. We're still all together in Gondwana. And I've drawn, well, I just copied this, they drew Tasmania separately, but we weren't separate, we were still attached here. But here's the South Pole in Antarctica, and there are great ice sheets, as there are now in Antarctica. But this is 300 million years ago, the second of the great ice ages. And there's ice over a lot of Africa, part of India, and flowing out across Tasmania here, and some on to southern Australia here as well. That's just the continental situation at Wynyard-Tillite time. And this is Stephen Hand's map of the Tillite around Tasmania and the directions that the ice was moving. See, the ice is coming in, Antarctica is here, right? Right there. And the ice is coming off in these great big glaciers or ice sheets, not sure which really, flowing in from the west coast. And this one heads off north down an original valley, presumably. And the numbers are the thickness in metres of the tillite deposits. The stuff that the ice deposits, that drops out of the ice. And Wynyard here with 550 metres is definitely the thickest deposit of glacial till around Tasmania. There's quite a bit down here, Hobart in places, and through the Midlands. And these crosshatched areas are the highlands where the ice didn't get, so there were significant high areas and the ice flowed around there. And then out to sea here at Wynyard, in what must have been a huge fjord type valley. Wynyard Tillite it's one of the best exposed old tillites in the world. And people have come from all around the world to study it and admire it. And I'm not surprised. This is a typical view looking down on the shore platform with drop stones. You all know what a drop stone is. Ice floating in icebergs through the sea, melting slowly, and all of the pebbles and rubble contained in that ice rain out and drop onto the seafloor, onto the mud. And that ice has been coming across Antarctica, Western Tasmania. It's picked up all sorts of the local rocks along the line. And that's one of the really interesting things about the Wynyard Tillite, is the range and the diversity of rock types in these drop stones. There's everything here. And some of it you recognise as local. Oh yeah, that's a bit of magnesite from up Arthur River, magnesite perhaps. There's a bit of pink granite from the Heemskirk granite up near Zeeland. And quartzite, of course. But then there are things you don't recognise.
I've left you a rock on your table.
Like that one.
And I found it in amongst that lot.
Did you find it?
Yes.
Joe gave it to me, or borrowed, loaned it to me.
Well, it's still there because if I meet her up, I'm going to flog it.
I was going to hand it around.
No, not that one.
No, this is a small piece of it. It's called Nice, G-N-E-I-S, Nice. We don't have it in Tasmania, but it's not uncommon in Antarctica. So we know this has to have come from Antarctica. Joe's really proud of this. And it's such a nice looking thing too. It's a high grade metamorphic rock, which means it's been subject to a lot of pressure and heat, so it's converted from what it was originally, whatever that was, into something that's pretty different. And it's got a sort of banding texture through it and blobs of pink stuff, which is probably feldspar. So it's a classic piece of banded gneiss, and it's come a long way to get to here. I'm going to hand it around, but maybe you can have a look in the dark. We might be lucky if we see some tomorrow, perhaps. But Jo's inordinately proud of a big piece of gneiss that she found.
Can you tell me about the other one, the bit I done on the test?
Sorry, I'm not with you.
Can I tell you, can you say something about the big lump I've dumped on your
Oh, there. Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. I'll have to leave it till we've got some light afterwards, if you like. Yeah, this is another part of it. You can see the drop stones and what we call the till or the tillite, which is this muddy stuff with stones in. But there are also sandstone layers, and in this area there are quite distinct folds in the sandstone. And that's happened where the ice is actually grounded. Mostly the ice is floating, as it does in Antarctica, off the ends of the big glaciers. But when there's a big surge of ice, sometimes the bottom of it touches the seafloor, and it can push the sediments forward and create these sorts of folds. It's a pretty good example, really. Other places further around to the east, Pines Point, those places, you see lots of these thinly laminated, fine-grained mudstone things. They're probably off the far end of the deposit where you're just getting the fine mud falling out onto the seafloor. Sometimes we call them varves, if they're related to annual melting of ice. They're typically on land, and lakes have varves where the ice melts. You get a layer of sand and mud, and it freezes over until the next melt. You get annual deposit. There's something like that. These ones I have absolutely no idea about because they're all kinds of funny rolled up textures in the muds. I thought somebody was trying to make scones here. Pretty big scones, but that's what they look like. Somebody's got some muddy dough, formed it around and tried to make scones. It's quite a complex environment. You can imagine there's a huge wall of ice at one point, raining out fresh water from as the ice melts into the sea. It's all sort of floating mostly, and all sorts of stuff is raining down at the front of that ice. And the ice is moving forwards at times and then retreating and forward and retreating multiple times. So it's a really complex environment. And that's why people from all over the world come here, because this is one of the great examples of that Paleozoic ice deposit.
Can I just ask you about your diagram on page 138 of the ice over 800,000 years in terms of the fluctuation in temperature, presumably over that period of time? You just mentioned the movement of the ice backwards and forwards. This argument about climate change at the present time. Can you say something about that, please?
Well, can we let Keith do his lecture?
I'm happy to talk about that at the end. Yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you.
So this is the latest researchers' reconstruction. Lindsay Henry from Milwaukee University in the States. Here's the front of the ice, right? This great ice sheet that's come down and is melting into the sea here. And this is the Wynyard tillite depositing on the seafloor. Several things are critical. There's a plume here of fresh water as the ice is melting. Fresh water floats on salt water. So it surges through here, depositing these conglomerates and gravels and sands and stuff, then makes its way up to the surface, and you get probably some fallout of mud and stuff over here. These are icebergs that are carving off the front of the glacier here and melting and depositing all of those drop stones on the seafloor here. And she's tried to show something of the sort of interfingering nature as the glacier advances and retreats, and you get all sorts of intermixing of the various rock types. And then way out here you get the fine-grained, muddy things. It's really complex. If you walk over much of the Wynyard Tillite, you'll see all kinds of things, many of which you won't understand if you're like me. But it's just a fabulous example because it's all so clearly exposed, being on the foreshore. That's what makes it world famous. And Wynyard has one of the great exposures of that mid-Paleozoic glacial deposits from anywhere. And I'm not sure that everyone in Wynyard appreciates it as much as you do. Right, moving on to the Jurassic dolerite, which is a fairly in-your-face kind of material. This is the road up to Ben Lomond. If you've ever driven up to the top of Ben Lomond, you would have gone up the Jacob's Ladder, as it's called. Up this little scree field makes a bit of a gap in the cliffs here, and the road winds up through, which is quite aerating, and I have known people who got to the bottom of that and looked up and said, no, I'm not going up there, turned around and gone home. But the dolerite is massive and very distinctively Tasmanian. It's igneous, which means it was in place hot. As it cooled, it shrank slightly, as cooling things do. As it shrinks, it creates these columnar joints. They're just shrinkage cracks. And then as they weather, they become more open. And if you get a bit of cold weather with freezing thaw, water gets into the cracks and freezes, opens them up gradually. The roads, pieces drop down, you get screwed. Fantastic stuff if you're a rock climber. That's it down on the coast at Tasman Peninsula. Makes a really interesting coast. Some of our highest sea cliffs are just columns of dolerite coming up out of the water. Sim and I got up close and personal with some dolerite when we were younger and sillier. I had a field assistant who was a rock climber. He said, you could do that, you could do that. So he persuaded us to go with him up to the organ pipes on Mount Wellington. There he is up there. He skimmied up this thing without thinking about it really, and then belayed us with a rope down to the bottom. Sid went up before me, and this is the technique. You have to put your feet on one side of this crack. It's called pulpit chimney. It's a classic chimney. And your hands and shoulders behind you, and then you work your way up. She got there. You think she looks a bit relieved having got to this flat rock?
Which was hard to sit up or down.
You don't have to go there. It's fun if you episode on the road.
We eventually all got to the top of this thing, and it's an isolated sort of double column. Then we had to get off. And the abseil, you have to abseil off. We weren't all that good at abseiling either, really, but we got down, and that was the end of our climbing career.
Very wise.
We come to the seen as or tertiary, as I call them in the book, the younger things. And this is Fossil Bluff, this is where we'll go tomorrow. And this is one of the great contacts between tertiary rocks and Permian. So this is the Wynyard Tillite, it's about 300 million years old. This is Fossil Bluff sandstone, it's about 20 million years old. So there's a very big gap in time here. And there's a good question which Joe had to ask me, of course. Where's all the rock gone that was originally above the Wynyard Tillite before this stuff was deposited? And it's a good question, it's pretty hard to answer if there's nothing there now. My feeling was all of that erosion by the big rivers that I was telling you about going out into the Bass Basin at that time, that's probably taken a lot of it all, I reckon.
When was this taken?
A while ago now.
20 years?
No, 4 or 5.
Where is it used?
Sorry?
Fossil Bluff.
Yeah, we've come around the corner from here and the golf course is over this way. And this is the shelf you can get up to near the contact here. It should all be much the same, hopefully. But it is so rich in fossils, this stuff. Look at the amount of shell material in here. And the shells aren't much different from what you would see now on a shelly beach. You know, abalone and all those things are here. It's a wonderful shelly shoreline deposit. And it's got just a few unusual fossils. This was my fossil fish. As a second year student back in about 1960-ish, we had to have a collection of fossil specimens, mineral specimens and rock specimens for our geology course. And I lived at Ulverston then, and a mate and I, he had a car, came along to Fossil Bluff to get some fossils. And we were wandering around out there, and one of the boulders had a little black thing sticking out the side of it. And I looked hard at this. They looked like bones. They looked like bones, and only sticking out half a centimetre or so. Anyway, we managed to break off the piece, and I took it up to the Queen Victoria Museum in Launceston, showed it to Dr. Eric Scott, who was then the curator of vertebrates, I suppose. He looked at it and he said, "You've got a fossil fish here, Corbett. What are you going to do with it?" I think I took it, I must have talked about it to my paleontology lecturer, Dr. Max Banks. He encouraged me to clean it up and write it up, because it was fairly important. And I spent days and weeks with a dentist drill cleaning the embedded sand and stuff around these bones. It was enough to put me off being a paleontologist. And that's how it came out. It was quite well preserved. Here's the backbone vertebra here. And most of the bones were there. Max Banks got a fresh flat head, cut its head off, put it out in his backyard for a couple of weeks for the ants to clean up, which they did. And he gave me this modern skull to compare it with. And that's what I did. I compared every single little bone on that fossil to the equivalent bone here, and they compared incredibly well.
Did you draw this?
Yeah, well, it was probably traced from the photo system, but I'll do that. This is what I published way back in the Royal Society Journal. It took me a few years to publish it, mind you, but the conclusion was that this is a fossil flathead and that it's virtually identical to the modern sand flathead, which you would all know, Platycephalus bassensis, that's called, except that it's 20 million years old.
How big was it, Keith, the bones that you found? The head that you
Oh, it was a moderate size flathead by today's standards. Yeah, it wasn't huge, just moderate size. That sort of stuff.
That's like 1960.
I found it in 1960, finally published this in 1985, I think. And I think it is still the only fossil flathead ever found. That's nothing special because it just means that they're pretty rare and you've just got to be a little bit lucky. There are probably lots of them fossilised somewhere. But it was, and still is, I think, the oldest flathead ever found. So, you know, I've been a fisherman for part of my life, and I suppose I can have some small pride in saying I've caught the oldest flathead.
Did you have photos as well at that time?
Pardon?
Did you photograph at that time?
Yeah, I haven't shown you the photograph because this was a bit clear, but it was pretty, you know, it was a good thing to do, I suppose. But as I say, it was tedious and time-consuming, and it took me ages. And that's what vertebrate paleontologists spend a lot of time doing, just cleaning matrix off bones so that they can see. Nothing brilliant about that, it's just bloody tedious. The other things that have been found at Fossil Bluff are a whale, part of a whale skeleton called Post-Polydon, and another thing which was called Wynyardia bassiana. And in the book I call Wynyardia bassiana a wombat-like fossil, but I've been back and checked that again to the original, and it's not a wombat, it's a possum. I'm pretty sure it wasn't a very good preservation of the skull, so it wasn't quite clear, but I think it's probably a brush possum. So maybe the brush possum was coming down to eat my flathead. But a 20 million year old possum is pretty significant too, and for a long time it was the oldest marsupial in Australia. A long time. But I think now they have some at a place called Riversley in Queensland, where there's a lot of tertiary material. And they have some more there. So, in that rather odd way, Fossil Bluff's quite important.
Keith, a quick one. What was the climate like at the time of laying down those fossils? In that there's hard corals in there. So it must be quite temperate, even though it was fairly south.
Good question. But it was probably a bit warmer than it is today. Yeah, I think that is a good question. There are corals.
Yeah. That's why I asked you this question about your graph.
I think I can get back to you.
That's a good question, that graph. It's an important graph, though. So moving on from the tertiary sediments to the basalts, which are the other critical part of that part of Tasmania's life. Remember, we're travelling north at this stage, attached to Australia, moving north at 7 centimetres a year, got a long way to go. And part of what's happening is that basalts are being erupted here and there on fault zones and things. And it's the basalts that are perhaps the most important thing for northwest Tasmania. This is a nice picture of Table Cape, taken from the air by a nice local fellow whose name I forget.
Gary McCarthy.
No. Anyway, he made this available for our big book on Tasmanian geology as well. It's a lovely view. And you can see how productive and fertile these basalt soils are. It's just phenomenal, really, how good the basalt soils are. But the reason northwest Tasmania is not the centre of the world as far as Tasmania is concerned, that all the money is in the Midlands and to the south, perhaps, where all the rich graziers went, because that was already clear. Those were open woodlands. They didn't need much in the way of preparation. This basalt was covered in tall, dense forest, every square inch of it, and it had to be cleared before people could farm it. That's what took so long. It took decades to clear this stuff. And I'll have a picture, just to go back. And this is the nut, which is very much the same as Table Cape. And what you've got left here is the original lava lake of lava that was sitting in the middle of this volcano. Here's the volcano reconstructed, and the sides of the volcano were made of soft volcanic ash and thin flows and stuff. They were there. That's what contained this lava lake in the middle, but they've now been eroded away. This is quite old. It's 12 million years old or so. So all of that stuff's been eroded away. There's a little bit there around the seaside of the nut. Otherwise you just don't see it. And all you've got is the big lava lake deposit of hard basalt that was in the middle. That's the same for Table Cape.
There's supposed to be a volcanic plume off the far northwest coast, drifting down from Queensland over millennia. Can you say something about that?
Yes, I will.
It's extra hot, it's not true.
There's a hotspot plume under Eastern Australia that Australia's been slowly migrating over, which is why you get older volcanoes in Queensland, younger ones coming south. Another story, really. You know what the basalt soils are like. I was brought up on this stuff and I've still got it in my veins to some extent, I think. Just so rich. And you see the cuttings as you come through sassafras, thank you, on the roadside. And there's 6, 8, 10 metres of red basalt soil there before you get into any rocky stuff. Just seem endlessly productive. It probably isn't, but that's how it seems. The Burnie fossil, you will know this outcrop of columnar basalt here. That's what the flows look like. This is the one I like. There weren't many photos taken of this period on the northwest coast, and I'm so grateful to have found this one. This is what those basalt farms were like when they were opened up. Up to 100 big trees per acre. And the way they did it was to ring bark the trees. These have all been ring barked. That kills the trees, stops them growing, and you can deal with them later. You clear the underbrush, and then you can plant a crop in the soil. And that's what this guy's doing. He's planting something in here behind his bullet team.
So where is it?
Oh, I'm not sure, south of Burnie somewhere. But imagine being faced with that if you're just a smallholder. Maybe you've got a boy or two in the family to help. Yeah, I mean, that would take decades to fall those trees, cut them up, and then get rid of the stumps. It done a bit of that in a day, but it's nothing like this. So that's why it took so long for those fabulous northwest coast basalt soils to be opened up, to be properly developed. They started in about the mid-1800s, I suppose, and it wasn't until maybe 1930 or so that they were really starting to look clear. Prior to that, there were just miles and miles of ring-barked trees in the view. Final phase is the last glaciation in the Pleistocene. We have three great glaciations in Tasmania's history, one back in the Precambrian, one in the Permian that you know about at 300, and then the more recent one in the Pleistocene, which began about 2 million years ago, and we're debating whether we've come out of it yet or not. This was the maximum of that last glaciation. We had a big ice sheet across much of Tasmania then. Starting here just a bit west of Great Lake, this is the Central Plateau, gives you a scale. So it's a lot bigger than the Central Plateau. Right up to Sheffield, there was big glaciers coming out that way down the Forth. Here, right out to Black Bluff. Across to Rosebery, further west of Rosebery, down to Queenstown, down the King and Queen, down the Derwent. That was at the maximum cold period of that Pleistocene glaciation. That was early on. The later ones were progressively smaller than that. But a lot of that is what's responsible for our landscapes and our topography now, because they've carved and modified the mountains, cleaned out the glacier valleys. A lot of our wonderful mountain scenery now is because of this ice age glaciation. And this is a typical example you will know of Dove Lake and Lake Wilkes here, big glacier coming out around here. But that's happened about 20 times. That's the thing about the Pleistocene. And we have the evidence from the graph the gentleman's talking about. The temperatures have gone like that regularly through the Pleistocene. About every 150,000 years there's been a change. We've had an ice advance and then a retreat, advance, retreat. In the same places a lot of times. But it's very hard to see the evidence for that. So there's been ice up and down this valley a number of times. Sometimes it was a bit higher and it's gone over the divide here. And it's deposited lots of moraines and stuff down here, modified that landscape there. Don't see much of it at Wynyard, I have to say. All right, finally, here's Tasmania's table of geological history, starting back here in the Proterozoic, the oldest rocks, the quartzites here. Here's, you've got some of this at Wynyard, at Rocky Cape and Cooey, as I said. We're missing all of this in the granites. Then the second ice age, we've got the Wynyard Tillite preserved here. You've got a really good example of that. And then the next thing you've got are the tertiary sediments, Fossil Bluff and basalts. So maybe we can say Wynyard's not gone for quantity, it's gone for quality. And you've got some really cool geology here with the Wynyard Tillite and some pretty hot geology probably with Fossil Bluff. Hopefully that's it, is it? There's Fossil Bluff. What we might see tomorrow, by the way, here's all of these fallen rocks. Jo researched this, you may have heard this story from her, but back in about 1885, looking to build this huge, what's it called? Breakwater. and looking for rocks. The nearest source of rock was Fossil Bluff. They drilled a tunnel 12 metres into the story, 12 metres into the side of Fossil Bluff, and then a side tunnel, and then filled it up with at least a tonne of explosives. Blew it up, and it must have blown the end or the side off Fossil Bluff and created a huge pile of rubble, which they then railed. See, here's the railway line. It's still there across the golf course, the remnant. And Joe had showed me some of the steel iron spikes that were in down there to pick that stuff up. It made a good story from Fossil Bluff that most people weren't aware of. Yeah. That's it, thank you all.
Well, that was even more of a treat than I was expecting. Absolutely fantastic. And what a wonderful way of... Sorry? Oh, yeah. What a wonderful way of explaining, simplifying and explaining all those things that will tell us the story of the rocks. Now, some people are enrolled in Keith's excursion tomorrow. There are no vacancies, okay? So don't, please, we've had a lot of people turn up today. We have no places left tomorrow. And for those people who did get their email, Joe sent that out saying that, saying meet us at the Fossil Bluff car park at 10 to 10, which is good. But then she said there's no toilets at Doctor's Rocks, which is a true statement, but fairly irrelevant to the fact that the entire excursion is actually at Fossil Bluff. Okay. But yeah, please put your hands together again. I think we are just so Roger, can you hang fire? You've just let a few other people have a go, and then we'll give you Keith's undivided attention for a few minutes at the end. Mary.
Can you tell me the origin of the ochre, which I find occasionally in Chambers Bay?
Where's Chambers Bay?
Just tucked into the northwest corner of Table Cape.
Yep.
I honestly don't know. Is it a big, good ochre? Or?
Yes, just pieces. Sometimes
Yeah.
up to that size.
Yeah.
And it has all the colours of ochre, from brown to yellow.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I don't know that. There are, generally speaking, there are ironstone concretions and bodies and veins are quite common around Fossil Bluff, usually quite small things. Some of them are soft enough to scrape off, which would probably give you some ochre. Some of them aren't. I wouldn't call any of them ochre deposits. But ochre deposit, was it an Aboriginal one, do you think, or not?
No,
No.
my feeling is it's been washed down and it's amongst all the pebbles.
Yeah. I can't help you, but I'd love to have a look sometime.
Anybody else?
The graph?
Yeah, I'm not ignoring you.
Not the graph. I've been told, you go back to your plate tectonics, that there are plates within plates. I think you mentioned that initially. Is that the case or not the case?
Plates within plates?
Yeah. I've been told that there's a crack, if you like, between Companion Hill and out towards Table Cape, and the northwest Tasmania is actually drifting off as a result of a movement, if I can put it like that. Is there any justification in that claim?
Very little.
Okay.
We do have a few active faults in Tasmania, just a few. Mostly they're vertical faults, one side's going up and the other side going down. I can't think of any large, there aren't any large transcurrent faults where you've got significant lateral movement happening. I'm sorry, I won't call that an old wives' tale, but there are lots of stories like that around geology, which is a real shame because mostly they can be knocked in the head with a bit of simple factual material or even a look at a geological map.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else?
The other thing, and while I'm on that graph, there's a graph in my book. It's a temperature graph for the Pleistocene. It's really accurate. It's done from isotopes in shell deposits in seafloor, which goes back quite a long way, and it's really accurate. And you'll see that it's almost perfectly regular, going up to a cold period, down to a warm period, back up to cold, down to warm, and it's going back regularly at about 100,000 years per cycle. We're now in the warm period of the last one, which is called the Holocene. We may go back to a glacial period, or we may bugger up the Earth's climate and we won't get back to that. Maybe we don't want to get back to that, but it would be nice to not get too much warmer, I suspect. So that's how things are through ice ages, and that's probably the same with the old ones, but we don't have the detail. It's not a stable, continuous, settled period at all. Things are fluctuating. Why they're fluctuating, that's another story.
Yes, Colin. Oh, no, Max. Yeah.
At what sort of stage, Keith, would you reckon that the Henty fault was going? Because I'm particularly interested in that, as in that. What sort of stage in your picture of Gondwana and so on do you reckon that started?
I think the Henty's moved, it's probably moved several times, but all back in the Paleozoic, around about Mount Reed time, and around 500 million. It was active then, I think. Certainly been moved in the Tabarabran, in the Devonian again. There may have been slight movement in the Tertiary. I think Ronberry might have some slight evidence for that, but not much, and it's been pretty quiet since then. So it is one of those old faults that gets reactivated several times, but not much happening at the moment.
I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, you can. There's a fault called the Lake Edgar Fault. If you ever drive out the Gordon Road and turn off down the Scotts Peak Road to the Scotts Peak Dam, there's a little dam before you get to the main dam called the Lake Edgar Dam. The Lake Edgar Fault, which was known about at the time, goes right under the middle of that little dam. Well, they had to put the dam there anyway, otherwise the whole lake was going to leak out that way. But there's a little look out there, and you look down the plain, and you see a nice sort of depositional fan material, and it just goes boop, like that. And that's a fairly active fault scarp. It's probably been active over the last, 10,000 years.
What's the height of your scarp?
5 metres.
Right.
It's not huge, but it's big enough. The interesting thing was that the upside of that fault is on the same side as the new lake. There are always seismic activities go on if you suddenly drown a valley in water. Water's quite heavy, and you'll get some movement on little faults related. But the big new Lake Perros, they call it, lake was already on the upside of the fault. So its effect probably was to dampen down the natural movement on that fault, although they did monitor it for several decades.
Okay, last one, Judy.
The origin of St Valentine's Peak, please.
Yeah, St Valentine's Peak is one of the young conglomerate peaks back in the late Cambrian, about 480 million years. One of those big old river deposits, which happened all around Tasmania, really. hill, and then there was some folding in the Devonian which made an anticline out of those two things, and then the Permian glaciation came through on its way to the Wynyard Tiller probably, and it just planed off the top of those peaks. And so now you've got Valentine's Peak here doing that, Companion Hill here doing that, and the top's cut off. Nice logs.
And just on that, is that Keith sold all the books he had here today, but Wonders of Wynyard brought more knowing about his presentation today.